We live, BK.
We live, JT.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to your Bedroom Super Producer podcast, episode number 15.
That's right.
Nonetheless, we've made it to number 15.
Number 15.
And BK, we've got a great episode for our lady composers and fellow composers as we are venturing out of the urban scene and into another musical universe, one that you and I both have a very deep admiration and nerd love for. What is it exactly?
I think we're talking about movie soundtrack, JT.
Ooh, movie soundtracks.
Indeed, the big orchestra and the whole cake.
Ooh, the whole cake, indeed. And to get the ball rolling with movie composers, we've chosen a guy that we both have studied for a very long time, from really like the late 80s until now. And it was very fitting because he's still very vocal, very visible in the media, and very current, I would say, as his soundtracks really have an impact on pretty much everyone, both from the musical perspective, but also like the pop culture as a whole. Can you tell us a bit more about this incredible gentleman?
Well, first of all, we're talking about the only composer that's relevant to anyone who's seen a movie in the past decade. We're talking about Hans Zimmer. Hans Zimmer. And of course, he's a composer. I think everyone knows Hans Zimmer. He can be a director or producer. Usually, he's usually the go-to composer that people from Hollywood love to go to. And to have a quick bio on Mr. Zimmer, he was of German descent, born in 1957, West Germany in Frankfurt, to be more precise. Plays mainly piano. Started his career playing in, how can I say this? We could say punk bands, retro bands in the early of his career. I think we could say that one of the thing that people could know him without knowing him, I think one of the bands that he played with was called the Bugles, and he was in the video and the track called Video Killed the Radio Star. I think it was published in 1979. So most people don't know that, but that was him playing the keyboards in that video. Ironically, I think, wasn't that song, I think it was a video on MTV or something. I think it was one of the first videos on MTV or something. We would have to check that, but and then basically he got into film music after that by word of mouth and by making contacts with different directors and different composers. And then the first thing that he made that most people know was the soundtrack for Rain Man with Tom Cruise and Dustin Hoffman. So I think we can pick up from there and then pick up our discussion of this great composer.
Incredible journey that this guy had, really, when you think about his pop days and then went on to be probably the most, I would say, successful, financially at least, Hollywood composer.
Indeed.
Okay, so I have a little game I want to play with you today, BK, and I got 3. And you know my questions are always difficult ones, so I have 3 very difficult questions for you to start this off. What is your favorite Hans Zimmer scored movie?
Favorite Hans Zimmer scored movie? There are many, since he has this particular sound that we love. I'm gonna say my favorite score, Inception.
Okay, favorite score, but favorite movie, because favorite score was my second question.
Okay, favorite movie, I think it's also Inception. Yeah, I think it's, but for me, it's the same thing.
That's the thing with like movie music, isn't it? Is that you can't really separate the experience. Like if you loved the soundtrack, I think it goes without say that you're going to love the movie, right?
Depends. I have movies that I don't like, but I love the soundtrack. But
Really? Can you give me an example of that?
that last movie with Brad Pitt, what's it
Yeah.
called? Ad Astra, I think.
Ad Astra. Yeah.
I love the soundtrack. Don't really connect with the story and the whole movie. It's super well filmed and everything, but the soundtrack is on point, on par. Like that's an example.
Yeah. They kind of I guess they kind of got inspired by the whole long, dark, brooding, heavy atmosphere of the boring parts of 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yeah,
like when they're waiting for the interviews with the moon crew and all of that.
Yeah,
it kind of feels like that,
yeah.
but without any of the beautiful action scenes in the spaceship and in space, basically. Yeah. All right, so we've got favorite movie Inception, favorite score Inception. What would be one of the more surprising scores that Hans Zimmer did that maybe people wouldn't necessarily know he did?
Maybe some of his earlier stuff. I don't know if you remember that documentary documentary / movie. I think it was called The Last Emperor. It's super old. I think it's from 1986, 87. Well, that was him.
Okay.
I think that could be something maybe that people don't know.
Interesting.
Even I don't know that soundtrack that well. Should go back and listen to it.
Indeed. After this episode, I'll certainly YouTube this stuff.
Yeah, there's so much good stuff. It's difficult to choose. What about you?
All right, I'll give it a go. I was trying to figure out what my final answers would be while you were answering. Favorite movie for sure, like you, Inception. I think that this movie, as The Matrix did in the late 90s, it kind of gave me this moment. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I always kind of saw the dream world the way Chris Nolan pictures it in the movie, but the whole time perspective and then the infinite loops, I was like, man, how did they come up with these? Like, you've been through those in your dreams, but you can't really like conceptualize it like that. So it was just groundbreaking for me.
Yeah.
As far as the favorite score, I think I'm gonna have to go with the first soundtrack I really fell in love with, and that was The Rock.
Oh,
old school movie. Yeah.
Wow.
And I think that really set the tone for Hans Zimmer's blockbuster sound for movie soundtracks. The whole horn-driven, really bombastic, super in your face. Whereas at that time, I guess that there was a lot more strings, and composers were more subtle in their use of brass.
Yeah, he kind of reinvented the whole like orchestral use in movies, because before people thought that as soon as you had an orchestra, it would sound like Star Wars. Basically, people thought it would be like that, and like he kind of reinvented the way he used it. And he was more picky and more simplistic and the recipe was very simple. And I think that's what got people back into orchestral music, to movies. The Rock, was that Michael Bay or was that Jerry Bruckheimer? Which?
I don't know.
No, I don't remember. The Rock with Sean Connery and Nicolas Cage, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool movie.
Yeah, it was a good movie.
Yeah.
It was a good movie.
Yeah.
I mean, it was at the time that the memes on Nicolas Cage weren't there yet.
Yeah.
And he was still like the number one Hollywood actor for a while. And then as for his most surprising work, I would have to say two movies. First is the Sherlock Holmes, the first one, where he has this kind of gypsy,
Very special sound.
weird sound. Yeah, really organic. Really, there's so much great texture in there. It's amazing. And then uh, a rom com, which is certainly not your typical gig for Hans Zimmer, and that would be The Holiday with Jack Black and Cameron Diaz, I think, and then the girl from Titanic. Yeah, I mean, honestly, you wouldn't expect Hans Zimmer to score a love movie or a love comedy, but this is one of the best like rom-com music I've ever heard, I think.
He seems to have an ability to really tailor his music to the movie and not just adapt his own sound to the movie or to adapt what people expect from him in a movie. And he seems to have this ability to kind of understand what the director wants, um, what the movie requires, what the character are all about, and to tailor his music to that instead of having his style like always adapted to the movie. And that's something that like many people and even in regular pop music, you tend to see these producers that want to pretty much put their own style on the artist instead of kind of creating a specific style for the artist. I think Hans Zimmer is very good at that, as really making the music serve the movie, the different scenes, the different characters.
Yeah, and I think that's what sets him apart because obviously there are people in Hollywood who can definitely write more intricate, more rich sounding music, but the way he creates this bond with directors is quite unique, I guess, in a way. And regarding his approach, did you take some time off to watch his masterclass?
Yeah, I took it like I didn't watch everything, but I watched a couple of classes. It's very interesting his whole process, the way he thinks about the movie in order to get to his ideas, and the way it's very interesting how, like you said before, he really gets to know the directors and he tries to understand what their vision is, what they think in their head the movie should be, even more than just watching the different cues or the different like images or the different edits that he gets. He really wants to get the big idea of what the movie is, what the characters are, and make music for that instead of just looking at a show reel and then composing to it. So I think sometimes one of the things that really surprised me when I watched the masterclass is that sometimes he doesn't even see the movie, but he talks with the director and they kind of establish a specific tempo that they want the scene to go to. And he composes it to a specific tempo. So he's not always composing to all the different like edits, all the different cuts. And that's what surprised me. Usually, like the easy way to do it is to make the music match every edit or every time a scene cuts or so that it fits. So that's one of the things that I noticed from the masterclass. What about you?
Well, very good point. I mean, obviously, I was hoping that he would show us his on the computer workflow, show us, the orchestral mock-ups and the way he sets up his Cubase rig and all of that. Um, and what I took from the masterclass was that technical aspect really doesn't uh, guide him as much as, like you said, what he can gather from the director's, like how he can pick the brains of the director even before having seen a second of footage. And I was reading some interviews, and he said a lot of the movies he scores, he actually sees the movie after. Like the director will come first and say, "Write me a piece about betrayal," or "Write me a piece about a dad loving his son or his daughter. And to that point, that's actually how he came up with the main theme in Interstellar. And if you allow me, I'll read a little quote from it's a Combini interview. And Hans says, "There was a moment where Chris said to me," Chris being Chris Nolan, obviously, said to me he was going to send me a letter, but he would not tell me what the movie was about. He just gave me one day to write whatever the letter inspired me. This letter, which was about a relationship between a father and his child, and I wrote this very fragile piece because he knows my children. Then I phoned him up and asked him to come over." And funny story also around this particular project is the fact that he wrote for a father loving a son, where in Interstellar, it's actually a daughter. So I thought that was interesting.
Interesting. Well, it goes to show that like his approach is pretty different from everyone else. I think that's what people in Hollywood like. The fact that I think his whole way of doing things is that he's always starting from a blank slate. I think even one of the things that I noticed that he talked about in the masterclass is that he usually doesn't want to start from a specific preset. Let's say he's using a synth or of some sort, and he doesn't want to start from a preset. He prefers building up something from scratch that's going to be tailored to a movie. I don't believe that he always starts from scratch, since he's always working. I think he has to have texts that are to keep his preset list up to date to what he liked and everything. But at the same time, his sound is so particular about a specific movie that I think you would notice if he would use something from the Sherlock Holmes movies in another movie. You would also notice if he would use something from Batman or The Dark Knight in another movie, because the sounds are so tailored to those movies. So I can understand that he tries to always start from a blank slate, and that assures the people that he's working with that they're always going to have something special from him. And I think that's why he's one of the most working, talented and working composers in Hollywood today.
For sure, hardworking he is.
Indeed.
And I think that to go along the points that you made, he really has a knack for creating sound palettes that will complement the colors and the picture. And like he's really at the crossroad between being a music composer, being a sound designer, being a sound engineer, and then almost being a director in his own right. He really takes part, as far as I could tell from my research, really takes part with the directors in the storytelling process, which is not necessarily something you would think about. In my mind, Hollywood composers were just given a task, like write music to this particular scene, and this is a love scene, and it needs to convey this or that emotion. But in the case of Hans Zimmer, he said, sometimes I talk about the movie and Chris Nolan talks about the music, and vice versa. So it's interesting.
Yeah, indeed. And I think it's interesting because I was also listening to an interview on YouTube, and he said that at some point, even he was meeting with the director and the editor, and they wanted a specific piece of music at a certain place in the movie, and he told them that that specific place didn't need any music. So basically he reassures them that at some specific places, the movie is good enough, the characters are doing what they're doing, the acting is on point, the dialogue is right there. I don't need to add a big orchestral thing to make it a point that it's the feeling of the scene. So I find it very interesting that a composer refuses to make music for a certain point or a certain cut in the movie, saying to them, well, it's just fine the way it is. Because sometimes when you're in so deep in the movie as the directors are and the editors are, that sometimes you kind of lose perspective, and you could even be a little bit, how can I say this, unsure of yourself. Is that good enough for that particular spot? And sometimes you need like a third set of ears to tell you, well, no, it's fine, you don't need to add anything. And I think that's one also of the thing that makes his soundtracks so epic, is that they're so simple. It's not, if you take a look at the orchestration of, let's say, someone like John Williams or anyone else in that palette of composers, it's usually more classical. It's got these beautiful melodies. It changes all the time. And for Hans Zimmer, he knows that at a specific spot, well, the theme here only has two notes, and he's gonna play with the dynamics. He's not gonna put a complicated theme where it's not needed, and that's what I like about his style.
That's also what amazes me from both Hans and all of these like A-level Hollywood composers, is the fact that not only can they write some of the most beautiful music, sometimes extremely complex, intricate, but also they can actually make that work with the scenes, with the director, with a bunch of people who all have their opinions. And so not only can they write the most beautiful music on its own, but they can kind of slalom through all of these hurdles. Because honestly, if you put me in front of the keyboard and there's a bunch of people there awaiting me to write the next Dark Knight, and they all know what the movie should be like, and you haven't even pressed a C note. Imagine the pressure that this guy can handle. It's just crazy.
Yeah, of course, he does like preliminary work, and he's shown his all the, like in the masterclass, he calls them his diaries. So basically, he has a whole session with a bunch of sounds, and he creates his themes. Like, let's say it's two notes here. Let's say here it's gonna become louder. Let's say this is a theme for Sherlock Holmes. This is a theme for another character. So he's done the pre-work, but I think it has to come with practice. Probably he's done it so many times, and he's been in that environment so many times. And usually they're at his place when they're doing the preliminary stuff. So he's not starting from scratch in front of 15 people and the orchestra's waiting and he has to write it like right there. So he's done the work, but it takes talent to be able to adapt your work, not to say, no, this is the way it is, we're not changing it. That's why I admire the fact that he can say, we can change this, we can do this, and do it like on the fly. And also you kind of have to be like a good salesman too, because you need to sell your songs at some point, and sometimes you need to convince people that this is what we need. We're not going to change it 1,000 times just because some guy says, oh, I think this should be you're not the composer, right? So, but you're right, like navigating that whole Hollywood bureaucracy, and it must be a little bit difficult. I think that's why he creates these lasting bonds with the directors that he works with.
Yeah, I guess the better the relationship becomes, the more creative freedom you get.
Yeah, exactly.
And I had this quote, Hans Zimmer talking about himself, and I think it really summarizes what we've been saying all along. And he says, my weakness is that I didn't go to music school, and that my formal education is 2 weeks of piano lessons. My strength is that I know how to listen. And I think that goes to show that training your ear sometimes is far more valuable than, learning the ins and outs of your DAW, for example, or getting overwhelmed by all of the technical aspects of computer music.
Indeed, that you have to listen. Kind of like what we were saying with Rick Rubin last week, that he was an incredible listener. I think Hans Zimmer is the same way. He listens like 100% more than the whole technical aspect of. But like he even says it in the masterclass that he's not a performer. That says it all.
Yeah,
Mm.
exactly. He'll be the first one to say that he doesn't really, he can't play like the whole theme sometimes that he composed. It's a very gradual process between him, his hands, the MIDI controller, and then the computer, and he'll patch things up. But then they become incredible masterpieces. Another thing that I caught in an interview that wasn't in the masterclass, and I think that actually in the ad that you can see on YouTube, if you get flagged by masterclasses retargeting, he'll show how he writes little melodies, and he says, "Oh, this is a question. Da-da-da.
Yeah.
Oh, this is a tough question. Da-da-da."
Yeah.
And in this interview, he said, "When I compose for a movie, I'm actually having a conversation with the screen."
Yeah.
And as we do in conversation between human beings, where we mirror the other person's body language, he'll mirror the body language and the facial expressions of the actors on the screen and try to convey that on the keyboard. And I thought that was incredible.
Yeah. That's really incredible. It's kind of like finding he he's very much about finding what's he writes to the story of the movie. It's kind of difficult to explain, but the story is essential to a movie, right? So you need to be able to write music consequently towards to better tell that story. So you need to find, if we could like put it in musical terms, you kind of need to find the the color of what you want to express in your music, or kind of the tone palette of the movie. And I think that's something that he does very well. And it's funny because I was reading one of his interviews, and remember when we were talking about equating notes to colors?
Yes.
Well, he does the same thing. I think it was in the Billie Eilish podcast where we were talking about synesthesia, that
Yeah.
you equate the same frequency to a color. And I think Hans Zimmer does the same thing in terms of the mood of the movie. Is it dark? Is it greenish? Is it, you can see that a lot in Inception and in Sherlock Holmes. So in Sherlock Holmes, it's very gray, greenish, and I think the soundtrack adapts to that. Inception, the same thing. And each layer of dream in Inception has kind of a different color grading. I don't know if you remember that. Even the music changes when they're in the first layer. It's kind of this airy pumping, like a big Moog, a drone pumping just to give like a heartbeat to the scene. And as they go deeper and deeper and deeper, it's gonna be something like faster on the drums, and like when they're getting shot at by on the mountain in the snow, it's very fast paced. But at the top layer, it's very smooth, and the notes are very spaced out. So he has this talent, I think, to really find exactly the right notes that goes with that that particular color grading that you have in the movies. And that's something that's, I rarely hear composer think about color in terms of music.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when you listen to the soundtracks on their own, you can still recall
Yeah,
that specific
you see the
color
scene
grading
exactly,
of such and such
Yeah,
movies. Yeah.
it's incredible.
I got two fun facts for you because I was listening to a bunch of soundtracks he did. Fun fact number one: did you know that the entirety of Inception's Dream Within a Dream is actually contained in To Die For from The Lion King? Meaning that the theme that is Dream Within a Dream in Inception is actually a piece that it's like he sampled himself from the old Lion King soundtrack in this particular track, To Die For. And if you listen at 1 minute and 37, it starts. So I invite both you and our listeners to go back to The Lion King To Die For at a minute and 37, and you'll see that in there is the same brass and string arrangement that was after that used for the Inception soundtrack. So I
Wow.
found that really yeah.
Right,
Who would
I
have
didn't know that.
thought
I didn't know that.
yeah. And then again, I was studying The Dark Knight and reading the on the cover art, there was a second name, a very well-known composer also by the name of James Newton Howard. And I was like, man, what did this guy do on The Dark Knight since it sounds so Hans Zimmery? You know what I mean? And I went back to one of his classics, The Sixth Sense. And there are 2 tracks on there where you can absolutely tell that most of the chords and the brooding, like string ostinatos that are played over and over in the Dark Knight soundtrack is actually one of the signature from James Newton Howard. So I thought that was really interesting. Kind of goes to show you that The Dark Knight is kind of a James Newton Howard soundtrack, but that was produced by Hans Zimmer. Where
interesting.
You hear the same voicings on the low brass, but once you do it the Hans Zimmer way, it gives you that Dark Knight and Inception sound. It's really interesting.
That's interesting. But there's a lot of soundtrack that were like co-produced like that. It seems that like Hans Zimmer, he doesn't always work alone. He has like a team of composer, even composer who do their own thing. Say Hans Zimmer's worked with like Rupert Gregson Williams. He's worked with Junkie XL. I think even Kung Fu Panda, it was a collaboration between Hans Zimmer and John Powell. It's so many. I think it's like an intricate, like Hollywood is a small place, I think. And like you said, all the Dark Knight stuff was, I think, co-produced with James Newton Howard. And so I think they trade so many things, like just to have a better product. Sometimes they work together, which for me gives a really special sound, and it makes you discover all kinds of different composers.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the technical aspect of this guy's world, and I think that anyone who loves gear will certainly have seen pictures on the web of his infamous studio. This Viennese brothel-looking room that he has. And what I find really striking, obviously, is the fact that it does not feel like your typical studio. And I heard him in an interview say, well, if I'm going to spend like 16 hours a day in a room, I might as well make it.
It's incredible. The place is incredible. It's kind of like an old, like, makes me feel like in those old Sherlock Holmes movies, kind of a like with the red suede and everything, with all the gear spread around. It's pretty incredible, with the wall of synthesizers in the back. It's pretty incredible. And it's what's fun is that it's a working studio, so it's not just like people see it as like almost as just like a normal room, but no. Everything was calculated. I think he was saying that the dimension of the studios, and the fact that I think behind the synth he had like a floating wall, kind of like a carpety floating wall behind, so that he didn't have any issues with standing waves, because the studio was big enough, so he didn't have any issues with standing waves, stuff that you would usually get if you have a smaller studio. and so it's technically very technically sound. And like he said, it's his jail that he comes there the most of the day. So it has to be comfortable. It has to be people need to be able to come in there, edit, talk about the movie and everything. So that's it's an incredible place. Honestly, it's I would love to have a place like that.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I was really impressed with the whole floating room concept. Where, what does that mean though? Does that mean that it's a double wall all around the studio, and even like the floor and the ceilings are doubled?
Kind of like when you decouple it with your speakers, you don't want the speakers to be on a surface that's going to be resonating, which is going to make some the other surface under it resonate. So if you want the pure frequency of like an item, it needs to be like with the least amount of contact on the surface. Well, I think the floor usually they make it that way, so it's kind of a floating floor. It has like minimum contact points.
Mm.
That's why when you like your speaker stands, that's why they're not directly on the floor. They're on these little like pointy nails. So your
Hmm.
so the bass is not transmitted to the floor, which could like when you listen to it, it could give you the wrong impression in terms of frequency. And I think for the walls, I think it's just kind of like a it's kind of just like carpet that just hangs so it can move a little bit when it gets when sound hits it. The fact that it moves a little bit, like it absorbs the sound, so you get so
Mm.
your space becomes a little bit dead, and you just get the sound. The resonance is just the pure resonance from the source. That's what I think. Any technical experts out there who know exactly what that is would be happy to hear from you guys.
Well, what that tells me is that Hans loves them low
Oh
frequencies.
yes, it's he. It goes well. That's the interesting thing in movies. You can go pretty low. You can go way lower than like if you produce like a pop hit or something that's gonna be ripped to MP3 or on a CD. And the movie in the theater, you can hear that Moog modulus sound. You can hear that rumble, those low frequencies.
Yeah, and he said that when they burned, if I may, the Dark Knight soundtrack on vinyl, the guys thought that there was a blank for like 20 seconds at some point. But if people recall that soundtrack, there's a song in there where everything breaks down, and then it's just like you said, like a Moog, or I don't know, it's this really super low bass tone, or bass pulse, I should say. And if you're listening to it in your your AirPods, good luck. I don't think you're gonna hear
You're probably
anything.
not going to hear anything. And on vinyl, it's normal that they think that it's like a blank space because vinyl has a specific. There's a cutoff frequency on vinyl. I think you can't go any lower than 40 or 50 hertz or something like that. No.
Oh, really? Because he said about the standing waves in his studio that they could go as low as 40 hertz. So I guess that it must be a higher for vinyl, something like 50 or
Yeah,
60.
something like that. Because it's. I think it's the. I don't think it's a question that it you can't print it, but there's the space between the grooves. There's like this space between the grooves, and at some point, I think you can't you can't print a frequency if you're gonna be on the other groove, right?
Right.
So I think that's there's a limitation to the frequency that you can print on vinyl. I'm not sure it goes with high frequencies, but I think it it applies mostly to low frequency.
Mm.
We would have to check. But I know that
Yeah.
in the past people would make um like the mix would be done in a certain way so that it would print well on vinyl, be it in terms of length of song or in terms of like frequency management in the mix.
Well, regarding the higher frequencies, I mean, when the CDs came out, like mixing engineers started to give that sheen at 15,000 hertz. So they must allow for a wider frequency range.
I think so. But even CDs, if you listen to them, they sound a little bit more bright than any cassette or tape or vinyl that you listen to.
Yeah, I think that the vinyls must not go way beyond like 10K.
Yeah, there's a limitation to it. We will have to research it,
Yeah.
but there's a limitation to the physical medium.
So if you're listening out there, Google Hans Zimmer studio, and you're in it for some wild studio porn.
Oh yes, oh yes.
That's all I'm gonna say about that. Something that also strikes me about Hans Zimmer is how much of a pioneer he was with technology. In a world where people were still, using pen and paper to write their music, he was really the first one to sample the orchestra and use it to enhance the orchestral music experience instead of just trying to recreate the orchestra in the box. And one thing that really amazed me from listening to a bunch of interviews and all that is the fact that he has what he calls bespoke samples. So whenever he's working on a movie, he'll record, dozens and dozens of hours of either soloists, percussionists, string ensembles, brass ensembles, and he'll create those colors and he'll keep those instruments in his vault. And he said regarding a specific cellist who had this incredible Stradivarius that he sampled the whole thing, and then the cellist sold the instrument for like hundreds of thousands of dollars to a Hong Kong collectioner. And he said, well, I still have that instrument in my sampler.
In his sampler bank, yeah, exactly. No, but Hans Zimmer is renowned for sampling almost like anything that all the people that he worked with, the great musicians that he worked with, because he's a sound buff. He's kind of like us. He's very particular about which sound he likes and everything. So he's renowned for like one of the guys who sampled pretty much everything. And before there was a time that we didn't have access to all the well sampled libraries that we have today. There was a time where there was no Symphobia, there was no all the SAM stuff. We didn't have all the Contact stuff. That the Contact was just starting out as a sampler. I remember like Contact 2 was a revelation, but it wasn't quite the same. We didn't have the firepower in terms of memory, in terms of processing and everything. And I don't know if you remember, but like when we were reading the old interviews with Hans Zimmer, he would have, because I think he started sampling with like the one of the first, I think, instrument that could like evolve with them was the Giga Studio libraries, I think. I don't know if you remember that. So I do now. So he would have these rack mounts of computers, basically servers, like 20, 30, 40 servers all connected together with hard drives in them, like RAID or hard drives or something. And he would collect all these samples. That was before computers had the firepower to just have a beautiful sample bank, like let's say Symphobia on an iMac. That was like 10, 20 years ago, So he's always been already collecting. And so, yes, he was one of the first that was like upfront, like on the like upfront on the technology side. And he always said to the musicians that he was sampling, I'm not sampling to take over your work or for you to not get any work, but he would always promise them that even if he sampled them, that he would hire them back to replay the parts, or to, when everything was done, to come back for a specific solo or everything. So he had like the vision to say that just because you could get more realistic samples with technology and everything, you could never really replace the human feel, or that little solo with little bits of mistakes here and there on the violin, or the sound of a particular instrument, or the sound of a particular wood with the varnish on it, the Stradivarius from the 18 something or 17 something. And he kind of, since he started in like 80s, mid 80s to like compose, he kind of put orchestral music back on the map by doing that. When people started to move away, slightly away, they wanted a more modern sound and more synthesizers, and people wanted something more like something from this year or something. And he kind of brought the orchestral, mixing them with synthesizers, and so a very forward looking composer.
Yeah, for sure. And with the massive sections that he brings together for certain projects, you can definitely tell that he's one of the big person who hires most of the musicians nowadays
Exactly. Like he,
in Hollywood.
yeah,
Like he's a
like he does everything, he composes everything, all the synth, all the parts with all the samples, and at the end he wants he wants the room to vibrate. He wants to move some air, so he's gonna hire that.
yeah.
Like, it's incredible. I was watching a video, like the Inception soundtrack, and like he hired this. I think the biggest. I think it was a brass, trombones, all kinds of like. And he said that you went in the room and you could feel the wind from the instrument. So it's, imagine the power of the tubas and everything. It was incredible.
Yeah, 4 tubas it was. I think it was for Inception.
Yeah, exactly. And I think he put them like higher. They weren't just in a room all on the floor. I think some of them were at a specific level, and then he had like another row that were a little bit higher. So, okay. So like testing all kinds of things. The microphones were a bit higher also. So all kinds of fun tests and fun stuff that he does.
Yeah. And to go back to your point about, the old days, the studio days and all of that, Hans Zimmer's experiences with sound and moving air kind of created a market all on its own. The whole contact library, and especially in the orchestral sampling world, the way you have these mega brass libraries, or these 60s violin section samples. This is kind of what he pioneered like 10 years before this becoming a thing in the computer music world. And I had never, I didn't know if those libraries pushed Hans to create bigger and bigger sounds, or the opposite. And it seems to be the opposite. So kudos to him to create those weird experiments of bringing in like 120 string players for a project, or like you said, like immense brass sections, and then play around with like 40 microphones and really try to mix a new unheard orchestral sound.
Indeed. And you can see that like he even like pretty much created like a new movement, like you said, all these libraries that were coming out. And then at some point Hans Zimmer himself came out with his own stuff on Spitfire Audio. I don't know if you remember that. But like, remember the first time we heard the Hans Zimmer strings and the Hans Zimmer percussions and the stuff that was recorded with, I don't know, hundreds of mics in a special room where he records all this stuff for his soundtrack. He said that like people were trying to emulate his sound, and he said, well, here it is. And now they're selling his sounds on the Spitfire Audio website, and they're pretty, especially the percussion stuff or the drum stuff, it's out of this world.
Yeah, I still haven't purchased Hans Zimmer percussions, and I still have to write a few cues with my Hans Zimmer strings. But I mean, yeah, it's the good old days. It started with Symphobia, and since then, I mean, it's literally spawned companies that tailor pretty much all of their projects on that, like with that sound in mind. Companies such as ADO,
Yeah.
Project Sam, um, and even Spitfire. Before they actually teamed up with Hans, they were already starting to put out these libraries like the what are they called, the response to Symphobia, like the ensemble libraries that I just pulled up their website. Albion, all of the whole Albion line is literally trying to emulate that Hans Zimmer
Yeah.
sound, really.
True. Before he
Uh,
did his collection.
so there's so much that our listeners could benefit from looking at this man's pedigree and projects. It's just insane. We can't go over everything that he's done for the Hollywood sound, the movie scoring world, really. So why don't you invite us to a few more soundtracks that people could reference and learn from Hans Zimmer?
For me, there's plenty. Well, if you want to go back in the past, I think one of the soundtrack that influenced me the most of Hans Zimmer's was the Gladiator soundtrack. For me, that one was you could see people battling each other just by listening to it. Of course,
Yeah, the war scenes.
yeah,
The war scenes are really, really.
it's fantastic.
How can I put it?
They're
Enhanced
exactly
by
enhanced.
Hans's music.
It helps the cue so much. Of course, Inception. We've talked about that. Interstellar is also something very peculiar that he's done. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, especially with the never-ending ostinatos,
Yeah,
the way
it's-
the music
yeah,
never resolves. It's really, really something.
Yeah, it gives the. I find that it's perfect music to simulate the emptiness of space. That's what that's what I think when I listen to that music. Other stuff, of course, all the Batman stuff. You're not gonna be disappointed. The Dark Knight, Dark Knight Returns. One of my favorite, maybe not in terms of like a theme or a tune, but like the sound design part and in terms of synths. Blade Runner 2049, it's one of my favorites, the more recent stuff that he's done.
Oh, so that was Hans Zimmer.
Yeah.
Ah.
Also, well, there's so much stuff. If we go back in the past, some stuff that I love. Black Hawk Down, that was also him. It was pretty like it captured that North African mixed with orchestral tribal music. That's very interesting. And I think we could end with like one of my favorite soundtrack. Pirates of the Caribbean was also something that I loved a lot. So those are plenty of choices to choose from. I think you're gonna enjoy. Watch the movie, listen to the soundtrack. You're not gonna be disappointed.
Some might even say that he reinvented pirate music with Pirates of the Caribbean.
Yeah, exactly. It was kind of rock and roll, but with the orchestra applied to pirate movies.
Well, that's an incredible way to put it. I'll add one last one that really defined my love for epic Hollywood blockbusters, and that would be Crimson Tide from 1995.
Whoa, that's a big one. Yeah.
Crimson Tide. And even well, the ones where there's more room for synthesizers, they haven't aged as well, but I'll even add Backdraft to
Oh,
that
oh,
lineup.
that's
Yeah.
yeah, that's the good old days. Backdraft. Wow, wow.
And listeners, if you hear BK say "oh" like that, it brings back a
Yeah,
lot of
a
memories
lot
for
of
us.
memory. Yeah, indeed, indeed,
Yeah.
indeed. Which one are the? Are we missing any? I think one of the soundtrack that I really loved also, The Last Samurai was something that I listened to a lot.
Yeah, he doesn't always venture. Well, that and Kung Fu Panda were him venturing into the Oriental and Asian world, if I may.
Yeah, and also I think one last one for those who are gamers and who love to play first-person shooter. He also did Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. That was
Okay.
that was his
Okay.
track.
Wow.
So yeah, he's been playing the field, playing the field.
Yeah, it's just it's one of those people that it's kind of tough to wrap your head around how much
Yeah,
work this guy can pump out.
yeah,
Obviously, he has huge talented teams, but still, I mean, it kind of makes uh, the people that we've analyzed so far from the hip hop world seem a bit small in comparison to these titans of the Hollywood world.
yeah. Well, it's different. It's different. It's another art. I think it's another way of looking at things. It's another. I think different styles uh, require different talents, different way of seeing music. So, but yeah, if you compare a soundtrack to a beat, yeah, maybe you're like, not sure. I think the soundtrack might be up there.
That's a good point, though. Aren't they keeping the album format alive with the soundtracks? I mean, in a world where it's all single driven, these Hollywood composers still put together 10 to 12 uh, cohesive tracks together in one like incredible album.
Yeah.
That's just
Well,
it's still a
I think it's mostly promo for the movie because usually if you usually the soundtrack comes out 2 to 3 weeks before the movie, so it's kind of promoting the movie. You can listen to the music before you can go see the movie, but they didn't do that in the past. In the past, it was just the sound was in the movie when it came out, and I think as the genre became more popular and more popular, people wanted to hear the soundtrack, and with Spotify and with all those outlets, I think I find it's always fun to be able to listen to the soundtrack of a movie before seeing the movie. For me, it's an awesome experience. Sometimes I don't even go see the movie; I just listen to the soundtrack.
well, when you've heard some of the cues before seeing a movie and then you hear them in the movie, it's kind of a weird
Yeah,
experience.
but
It's really something
yeah,
else.
but you seem to like the movie even more.
I think
Yeah,
so. I think
it's
so.
because
Go.
you're prepared to hear the sound, and you're like, oh, yeah, you're kind of more open than just, and you can take in the. It's as if the fact that you've listened to it, you can focus a little bit more on the images, on the cinema, instead of everything all at once.
I've done that actually for two of his latest movies. I've done that with Interstellar because there was all of this woo-ha in the media, and they were really pushing Hans's score for that movie with the pipe organ and all of
Hmm.
that stuff.
Yeah,
And so I listened to the Interstellar soundtrack at least 2 to 3 times before going to see it at the movies. And also The Dark Knight Rises. Is that the one with the Joker? Rises?
um,
Anyways, the
I
one with
think
the Joker.
the second one. The second one
Right.
is with the
Yeah.
Joker.
It's the second
Yeah.
one. Yeah.
Yeah, but the first
Those.
the first one is Batman Begins, and
Yeah.
then there's Dark Knight. Dark Knight Rises is with Bane.
Oh,
I
okay.
think
So The Dark Knight.
I think it's the Dark
is-
Knight with the Joker.
Yeah.
Mm.
Anyways, those electric violins, man. Whew.
Oof. Yeah.
Yeah. They
That
really did it.
that that never-ending tension
Exactly.
Remember, it's there. You're like, oh, what's gonna happen? What's gonna happen? It's like it never ends. It just the string gets tighter and tighter and tighter. You never know when it's gonna snap, and it's kind of a special thing he did on those soundtracks.
Kind of plays with your mind, this Hans Zimmer guy, doesn't he?
Yeah, kind of, yeah.
Musical psyops.
Yeah.
Well, that about wraps it up for us today, guys. Thank you for listening to the episode. And I guess we'll see y'all in a week.
Yes, sir. We'll see you guys next week, and have fun. Stay safe.
Peace out.
Peace out. Thanks for listening to the podcast, guys. Remember to subscribe if you like what you hear. We're on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube. Also, if you want to support us, head on to delicatebeast.com. You can find our serum packs, our contact instruments, and also plenty of freebies if you subscribe to the newsletter. Don't forget to follow us on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and once again, keep making that awesome music.